So this is Jane Wright. I'm going to be talking about autonomic dysfunction, which is a term that I started using, gosh, back in maybe like 97 or something like that. The very first autonomic dysfunction I found, we already put on YouTube. It's sensory overload. But, there are... these are the autonomic dysfunctions I've found so far. So there's a couple hundred of them. Some of them are incredibly specific. Some of them affect everything. There's a wide range. Some of them are what I call engorgement conditions, where they just make something that's supposed to flow not flow. Or there's a range. Now, why why are we interested in autonomic dysfunction? Because it occurs a lot with people, and it's a type of thing that for some people, like I just worked with a woman yesterday who suddenly there's two autonomic dysfunctions that can occur in the appendix. And she had never had that before, but suddenly it started to occur. And with a very simple treatment, it can be backed off. But now that it's happened twice in a row, it may be a bit of a tendency of hers for a while to balance it out. And so what is autonomic dysfunction? It's, the thing that is really unusual about autonomic dysfunction is that it can manifest like that. Anytime the etheric of the area that we're talking about becomes dimmed down, that can be through infection or just over exertion, then these autonomic dysfunctions, they can occur instantly. And it makes it more complicated in the sense that you think of treatment as something that's a once and done thing. Well, if the patient has to learn how to do a treatment like this to keep themselves from, having the appendix blow up and all the severity that could happen in this instance, then it kind of seems like people are going to have to actually get involved in treating their own organism. It's either that or the condition just gets stuck. It doesn't go away by itself most of the time, and so it's pretty challenging to have to reorient people into terms of how to treat their body. One of the most common situations where autonomic dysfunction occurs is if there's a central nervous system injury. Now, the most common central nervous system injuries are concussion, Wong, contra coup concussion, landing hard on the floor and then your brain goes flying up into the skull, for example. Or a contusion, which is a much worse injury where the tissue is practically obliterated. These all can be treated. And then there's a lot of other things that affect the brain like that. Adhesion, you get a high enough fever, you get dehydration of the dura, the coverings, the meninges, the coverings of the brain. What happens is that sticks, it adheres to the brain. And so when this whole thing is kind of clamped down, the brain really will spasm to keep that from ripping tissue. So it's another common thing. But, any injury to the spinal cord, there's a lot of subclinical injuries to the spinal cord that don't necessarily paralyze a person, but, really are an injury. And so the way these autonomic dysfunctions frequently work is that you treat them And until that nervous system condition, like the adhesion or the concussion, unless that's treated, the autonomic dysfunction keeps coming back. The most typical time that it comes back is early in the morning. And there's something about that process of early in the morning. What happens is our astral body, our soul forces are going in and out, in and out. You know, we're kind of waking up, but we're not quite awake. And so the content of our feeling soul or our rational soul can be intense enough that that'll trigger these autonomic dysfunctions, particularly if the wiring, the central nervous system is wounded, and the body will spasm always around a wounded area, particularly in the central nervous system. And so, this amazing thing occurs that normally in a healthy central nervous system, it's in motion. That I first learned this through Sharon Weiselfish, may she rest in peace, and Frank Lowen. That the central nervous system moves slowly, 3 cycles per minute. Half of the brain moves one way, and the other half of the brain moves the other way. That sets in motion the movement of the spinal cord and the peripheral nerves. So the spinal cord, let's say this is the spinal cord, the whole thing, half of the spinal cord is slowly moving down, while the other is slowly moving up. It's very slow. But if this whole thing is in protective spasm, then that movement not only doesn't occur, but it allows a lot of adhesion to occur between the two halves that are supposed to be moving independently. You get a bit of injury in that area, then the whole thing can sort of stick together. So it's a very important thing, this movement of the central nervous system. And so what happens as a compensation for concussion, contusion, whatnot, is that we're much more likely to get autonomic dysfunction. If we have a meltdown, most people know what that means in this day and age, but when we really freak out, if you stand back and look, you see the feeling soul is very agitated, and what happens is that instead of, we talked about this on the astral body tape, that normally when we're triggered off, when we feel strongly, in an ideal situation, there's a I'm forgetting the name of this, Tom, sorry. A polarization, it's a set in motion. Electricity is set in motion. It's a depolarization, sorry. And so I'm triggered off by something. My feeling soul has been set in motion, mostly automatically, which isn't very good. And so what happens is this depolarization occurs, and in its ideal state, it should be passing up through the top of the head. But when we're really upset and we join thinking and feeling and willing together, then what happens is that the astral body starts to beat up on the physical and etheric. So an autonomic dysfunction has been set in motion. And literally, if you've had one in the past that you haven't had in a long time, and you really get upset, more often than not, it will recur. And so that's the second phenomena that triggers off these autonomic dysfunctions. The third is infection. And why does infection trigger off autonomic dysfunction? Well, we have this part of our organism called the etheric body. It's sort of like the plant part of us. And if that part is really full and is servicing and covering our whole organism, then we're in good shape. But if it isn't, then what happens is that infection gets a leg up. Infection, when the etheric is diminished, infection is increased. And when infection is increased, the autonomic dysfunctions can really roar around. So that's why, during a flu, for instance, there's an autonomic dysfunction that makes all of the limbs achy. And that has to do with an autonomic dysfunction that's occurring in the adrenal gland. So infection and anything that dims down the etheric forces is another element. There's another, which is a little bit more shaky ground, and that's negativity. Negativity. What is negativity? Well, in a certain way, negativity just rises up in any of us when there's something not quite right. Anything that's not quite right about our outer world, our feeling soul gets set in motion. It becomes a kind of a weaponized situation in the intersocial realm frequently, because the way it's been set up is that we can project negativity onto other folks. So I can, if I'm in a space of anger, I can actually project that onto someone else, and that can combine to contribute to their illness situation. So this is why I usually, with these Gestalt therapy things where people are pounding on a pillow and this is representing their mother, I tell people that really is damaging to their mother, to be visualizing pounding on them. It's not a helpful methodology. And anytime we actually scream and emote, then one of the things that happens is we get emotional muscle injuries, or we get bilateral spontaneous tears in the musculature. But then the biggest thing is that every time our soul feels, it makes an imprint into either the physical and etheric. So we can have like multiple imprints of our own anger in our physical and etheric, but also, the people that we emoted toward. There's something to the bodhisattva vow that until we are all free, none of us is free, because we've spewed out our negativity all over each other in the course of learning to be loving. Okay, well, we're going to learn to be loving, and it's just that all these things by themselves, okay, you can get by with having some imprints of anger, from your 22nd year, but you add that to these are bioccumulative. They add together. So if you add that with a number of other conditions, that's why I rarely say something causes something, because usually there's a combination of phenomena. So if you have this background where your father was constantly screaming at everyone in your family, lost his family farm during the Depression, he had his reasons for screaming, but it poisons and pollutes those around us, and so that it adds into the sort of, in Hinduism they might call it samskaras, the overarching negative imprints into the world that have, it can be what we have to overcome ultimately. And so when we're working backwards against the conditions that have combined to make someone appear in my office needing something, attention, the vastness of the amount of detail that our organism can, receive distorted influences of is, yeah. And so, how do you work with this? Well, teach the person, if they have autonomic dysfunctions that happen all the time, they should be able to ideally get that back in balance. It's not hard usually. They're a little weird, but they're not hard. That, and then, the soul damage. Unfortunately, our soul actually gets damaged by, especially in the formative years. So, your dad screaming at you would have been a different thing when you were 30. But when you were 3, it created some conditions that are very likely to recur, arise unconsciously in your organism at certain times. And, if you're lucky, it'll just trip you up in your interpersonal relations, or your, capacity to stay grounded and do something at any given point. But, they do add in all these elements. They add into generating illness, not by themselves, but they add in considerably. So unfortunately, negativity can also be set to somebody deliberately, and there are people who maybe are partially conscious, who send vitriolic, or, there's so many different variations of this that deliberately, poison their world, the people in their world through negativity. And there are some, this first autonomic dysfunction that I thought I would go over is very susceptible to that kind of thing. So, and it's kind of embarrassing that oftentimes people on a spiritual path, it's one of the things that we have to really learn, is that no matter what, we do not blast anybody. If we develop capacities, we can hurt somebody even more. So unfortunately, that can immediately trigger off certain autonomic dysfunctions if somebody has it out for you. And, we know that our history, people would talk about curses. Well, there is a reality to that. And it's how we're made. Why is it that how we're made that all these things can have an impact, and we are accountable for that impact. And so we can take somebody's ship down totally by deliberately sending negativity their way. Sometimes it's a collective thing. You often find that spiritual groups will feel threatened by, let's say, another spiritual group. I can think of examples of that. And so, wow, we have to become so consequent. That's a really important word, consequent. We have to be responsible for everything we emit in the world. It's staggering, the degree of responsibility we are. Okay, we can goof up periodically, and yeah, a lot of times the spiritual world can help us make amends in a short-term way, but ongoingly emitting, or ill will toward another person is really an unconscionable, unacceptable phenomena.